In Afghanistan, the number of civilian casualties continues to rise. On Tuesday, at least 8 people died after a bomb exploded in the southern provincial capital of Lashkar Gah amidst a major U.S.-led offensive in the area. Local authorities said all those killed in the attack were civilians. Meanwhile, Afghanistan's government's condemned a NATO airstrike on a convoy on Sunday that killed 27 civilians, including 4 women and a child. NATO Commander General Stanley McChrystal went on Afghan television to apologize for the attack, and Defense Secretary Robert Gates pledged a thorough investigation, but blamed the Taliban for using, quote, civilians for cover.
Is that we're at war. We are doing everything possible. General McChrystal is doing everything humanly possible to avoid civilian casualties. But it is also a fact that the Taliban mingle with civilians, they use them for cover, which obviously complicates any decision process by a commander on the ground in knowing whether he's dealing with the Taliban or innocent civilians or a combination of the two. I'm not defending it at all. I'm just saying that these kinds of things in many respects are inherent in a war. It's what makes war so ugly.
Last year was the deadliest of the war for civilians and foreign troops, and while there's no reliable count of the number of Afghans killed, the number of U.S. soldiers killed in the war has reached 1,000, this according to the independent website casualties.org. Meanwhile, the Afghanistan war has also surpassed the American Revolutionary War in duration to become the second longest war in American history at 8 years, 4 months, and 16 days. President Obama has twice escalated the war since taking office, first by pledging 17,000 troops a year ago, then an additional 30,000 troops in December. Well, our next guest argues the war in Afghanistan, quote, simply isn't going to work. It won't bring security to Afghans. It won't turn Afghanistan into a democracy, and it won't make us safer. That's Phyllis Bennis. She's a fellow of the Institute for Policy Studies and author most recently of Ending the U.S. War in Afghanistan, a primer. She joins us from Washington, D.C. Phyllis, welcome to Democracy Now! The latest news, the bombing of this minibus convoy that killed 27 people, civilians, that now General McChrystal has made a videotaped apology for. Talk about this.
Well, in a certain way, what Secretary of Defense Gates said this morning is true. This is what happens in war. This is why war is so ugly, he said. He could have said and should have said, this is especially why an occupation war in another country where you don't know the players, you don't know the culture, you don't have good intelligence, and you're participating in a civil war in someone else's land is inevitably going to reach these kinds of terrible results. There are already reports, as you mentioned, Amy, 8 more people at least, civilians killed today. The number of Afghan civilians is at least 50 just this week, just in the period of this new offensive in Marja in southern Afghanistan. And I think that what we're seeing is a very serious demonstration for any who doubted it, that this is a war against a vast population of Afghanistan. The claims that our new strategy is different, that our new strategy is not to kill civilians, the only way to stop killing civilians is to stop the killing. That means to stop all offensive actions, to stop and withdraw the troops, pull back the drones. This is the only way that there's going to be an end to civilian casualties. The notion that it's the Taliban's fault because they are among civilians, well, the problem is the Taliban come from those communities. They are those civilians. Many of the Taliban fighters who have, in the words of many U.S. and strategy officials, talk about how the Taliban faded away with this new offensive in Marja. They faded away because they live there. They've gone back to their families, back to their farms, and they will rise to fight again, presumably, if their interests are at stake, whether those interests are economic, whether they are issues of loyalty and connection to their communities. This is the inevitable result of this kind of a war, the escalation that we have seen during President Obama's first year. And yes, there is no question this is President Obama's war. He claimed it as his own even during the campaign. The fact that we have now reached 1,000 U.S. casualties, and we don't know, as you mentioned, we don't know significantly accurate totals of the vast number of Afghan civilians who have died in this war. We know that it has been escalating. There are now, by the time that President Obama's most recent escalation is finished, which is supposed to be in the next several months, there will be over 100,000 U.S. and allied troops occupying Afghanistan, and there are already over 104,000 U.S. paid mercenaries in Afghanistan in this war. So the war has escalated enormously in this period, and there's going to be a great deal of work to do to bring that war to an end. That's very much why David Wildman and I wrote this book on how to end the U.S. war.
So how, Phyllis, how do you end the war? What's the exit strategy?
The exit strategy has to start by ending the killing. There has to be a unilateral ceasefire that can set the stage, hopefully, for a reciprocal ceasefire from all the various parties that are at war here. It has to include, this isn't a situation where we can simply say, oh, let's pull out the troops and then we're done. Pulling out the troops, ending the drone attacks, ending these attacks that so consistently are killing civilians is only step one. It's only step one. We need to re-engage with Afghanistan in an entirely different way than has been made possible. We need to look at serious development assistance. We hear that the Marja offensive that is now underway, that the U.S. says is so important, it's become important because there are so many thousands of U.S. troops engaged in it now, that it's important as a showpiece. It's important, and they admit this, it's important for the political goals, not the military goals, the political goals of bringing into Marja what the U.S. officials are now calling a government in a box, a government standing on the sidelines ready to come in and govern, and new aid workers ready to come in to provide all the services that have been missing. Well, the problem is that all those aid workers are Americans, and the so-called government in a box is a government created under U.S. control in Kabul, made up largely, unfortunately, of different tribal and ethnic and linguistic groups than the people who actually live in that area. It's likely to be seen as a foreign government, not quite like the U.S. directly, but not part of the local community, which has always been the basis of how Afghanistan operates. And until the U.S. is ready to operate on that kind of a local level in conjunction with local leaders, women and men, Islamist and more secular people, which it certainly has not been prepared to do, the real need is for negotiations. The U.S. cannot be in charge of those negotiations, but it has to stop preventing those negotiations. The Taliban will have to be involved in those negotiations because they represent a component of the population and a component of the power. And if you're serious about ending warfare, negotiations have to bring everybody to the table. We're not going to be able to stand back and say, well, I don't like what they stand for. It's true, I don't like what the Taliban stands for. They have been terrible in their ruling periods to the people of Afghanistan, particularly, but not only, to the women. But if we look